We continue now at the top of Daf Gimel Amud Beis in Meseches Horayos. This is Horayos Daf 3b. On the previous summit, the Gemara asked, let's say you have a situation where a Bezdin issues a mistaken ruling. For example, the Bezdin issues a ruling that Chaylev is permitted, and a minority of the community acts upon that ruling, and then that Bezdin dies, and another Bezdin comes, and they go ahead and they issue the same mistaken ruling that Chaylev is permitted, and again, a minority of the community acts upon that ruling and commits the Aveira. If you would combine the two minorities, that would be a majority of the community. And so the Gemara asked, according to the one who says that the community is the one that brings the par, according to the one who says the Bezin brings the par, there's no question because the first Bezin died, they're not even around anymore, so no par is brought. But according to the one who says the community brings the par, do we say since it's all one Sibor, so in that situation they would bring the carbon, they would bring the par? O Dilma, or maybe Yediya Dahu Bezdin Dahoru Ba'inan, it needs to be that they became aware of the Aveira from that particular Bezin which issued the ruling, and the Gemara says, Teku, the Gemara leaves that as a question. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Yonasan says, Meya sheyashvu lahoros, if 100 judges, they sit to issue a ruling, Ein chayavin at sheyoru kulan, they're not chayiv until they all unanimously issue that ruling. Shenemar, as it says in the Pasuk, V'im kol adas Yisrael yishku, if the entire congregation, if they make the mistake and sin, and we understand that to mean, Ad sheyishku kulan, they all have to make the mistake. Now this Pasuk, V'im kol adas Yisrael, actually is referring to the situation where Klal Yisrael, or the majority of the community, sin based on the ruling of the Sanhedrin. When we say over here, if 100 are sitting to issue a ruling, there are not 100 members of the Sanhedrin. Some of the commentaries deal with the fact, how do you have 100 members on the Sanhedrin? Usually it's not that much, but in any case, the point of the Gemara is it needs to be a unanimous ruling of the Sanhedrin in order to bring this par, in order to have this situation of Kol Adas Yisrael Yishku. And the Gemara continues, Tifshot Hora B'chol Adas Yisrael. It means that the Hora has to be in all of the Adas Yisrael, which means from the entire Sanhedrin. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Huna Breder Rav Hoshia, Rav Huna the son of Rav Hoshia says, Hachinam mistabra, it makes sense to understand the pasuk in this way. Because in the entire Torah, we have established that the majority is like the entirety. And here it says, all of the Eda, and therefore it's adding all of it, and so therefore, Ho'ol V'kach, since it's stressing that, Afilo Hein Meya, even if there are 100, it has to be unanimous. And Rashi explains that Shetifshot Hora B'chol Adas Yisrael, the ruling has to be B'chol Adas Yisrael, and Rashi says, Dehainu Osan Sheyashvu L'Horos, we're referring here to the people, the judges, that are sitting to issue the ruling. And the Gemara continues, Tanan, we learned in our Mishnah, Horu Bezdin, let's say the Bezdin, the Sanhedrin issues a ruling, V'yada Echad Mehen Shato, and one of the judges knows that they made a mistake. O Talmud V'roi L'Hora, or one of the students who is able to issue rulings, he knows that they made a mistake. V'halach V'yasal PM, and he goes ahead and he acts in accordance to their ruling. Bein sha'asu v'asa yimoin, whether they acted in accordance to the ruling and he did it with them. Uvein sha'asu v'asa acharein, whether they acted in accordance with their ruling and he acted after them. Uvein shalo asu v'asa, whether they did not act in accordance with their ruling and he acted in accordance with their ruling. Hareza chayiv. In all of these cases, this judge, let's say, is going to be chayiv, and the reason is mibnei shelo tala bebezin. The reason why he's chayiv is because he was not depending on bezin. He was not depending on the court. He knew that they were mistaken. Therefore, it's not considered that he did the Aveira based on the mistaken ruling of the court, and that's why he's chayiv to bring a carbon. And the Gemara says, Hayhu de chayiv. The Gemara says this individual is chayiv. He's chayiv to bring a carbon. Ha'acher pater, but another person would be pater, would be exempt. Meaning to say that if it was another individual who was not aware that the court had made a mistake, that person would be pater because he was simply acting on the ruling of the court. And as we said in the Mishnah, in such a situation, a person does not have to bring an individual chatos. But the problem is, this contradicts what we just said above. V'yamai, now why should this be the case? Halo nigmara hora, isn't that considered to be a ruling that really is not a final ruling? Because as Rabbi Yonasan said, if you have 100 that are sitting to issue the ruling, we're not going to consider it a ruling with regards to these halachas unless it's unanimous. So in this case, it was not unanimous. There was one of the judges, as the Mishnah said, that thought it was a mistake. Clearly, it was not a unanimous ruling. And still, what are we saying? We're saying that the person could be exempt because he can say he was following the ruling of the court. And the Gemara continues and answers, and here what are we talking about? That person who understood that they made a mistake, he still nodded his head. He still made it appear that he agreed with the court. It appeared to be a unanimous decision of the court, and therefore it does not contradict the statement of Rabbi Yonasan. And Rashi explains, Kagon shehirchinahu echad mehem, that judge, he nodded his head, O Talmud, or the student, Barosho, nodded his head, Denira kahoda ledevreim, it appeared that he did agree with what they were saying, V'nigmara hora, that's called nigmara hora, that's called a final ruling. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, come in here, a proof, this is from a Mishnah coming up, Horu Bezdin, if the Bezdin issued the ruling, V'yada echad mehen shato, and one of the members of the court knows that they made a mistake, V'yomer lan, and he says to them, Toan atem, you've made a mistake, Hare elu peturim, so then the Bezdin is going to be exempt in terms of issuing this mistaken ruling. And so the Gemara says, Taima damar lahen, Toan atem, the reason why they're exempt is because he said to them that you're mistaken, de peturim, that's why they're exempt. Hashasik mishtak, but let's say that judge would have been silent, Chayavin, so then apparently they would be liable for the mistaken ruling. The Gamar lahora, and that would be considered to be a conclusive ruling. And so the Gemara says, V'amai, now why should that be true? V'halo horu kulan, again, it was not a unanimous ruling, so why are we treating it like a Gamar hora? And the Gemara again answers, Amri, they answer Hachanami here also, Kagon Shehirchen Barosha, the case is that he nodded with his head, and therefore, in all appearances, it was in fact a unanimous ruling. And the Gemara continues, Mesev Rav Mesharshi asks the following question from a Brisa. The Brisa says, Samchu Rab Oseinu al Divrei Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, v'al Divrei Rab Elazar Rabbi Tzadok. Our rabbis, they relied on the words of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel and Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Tzadok, Shayu Omrim, that they said, Ein Gozrim Gezeira Latzibor, they said, we do not make a decree on the community, Elim Kain Rov Hatzibor Yecholin Lamod Ba, unless the majority of the community is able to stand the decree. And so here we're using a concept of Rov, we're using a concept of majority. V'yamar Ravad Barab, and Ravad Barab said, Micro, where do we see this in the Pasuk? Where do we see this idea? It says in the Pasuk, Ba Me'era Atem Nayarim, you're cursed with the curse, V'osi Atem Kovim, and you rob me, Hagoy Kulo, the entire nation. And so we're learning from Hagoy Kulo, the entire nation, that the entire nation has to be able to take the Gezerah. That's the only time that we make a decree. But how did they interpret that? They interpreted that as Rov HaTzibur, as the majority of the community. And so the Gemara says, V'hacha, but over here, Techsiv Hagoy Kulo, it says the entire nation, V'ruba Kakula Dami, but we're saying that the majority is considered like the entirety. And so therefore, Tiyufta de Rabbi Yonasan, Tiyufta, is this a refutation of Rabbi Yonasan? The Gemara says it is a refutation, because again, Rabbi Yonasan's entire derivation was from the fact that it said the entire Sanhedrin, and we understood not to employ the rule of Rubo Kakulo. And so the Gemara continues and asks, well, if that's true, if we've refuted Rabbi Yonasan, V'yelamai kol adas to Kamar Achmona, so what does it mean when it says kol adas, which the Pasuk says, if we're not learning out that it needs to be unanimous in order for it to be considered a ruling? And the Gemara answers to that, Hachi Kamar, this is what the Pasuk is saying. I'ika kulam, if you have all of them present at the time of the ruling, have a hora, that's considered a ruling. V'lo, and if not, lo have a hora, that's not considered a ruling. So it's not that they need to be unanimous in their decision, but they do all have to be present. And Rashi explains, Ba me'era atem nayorim kagon shahagoy kulo diyachon lekabel. It means again that the entire nation is able to accept the decree. Hachi mashma, it's understood as follows: Ika goy kulo, if you have the entire nation, v'kavar Allah hay gavra, and then this person transgresses, osi atem kovim, then you rob me. V'hachi kasu b'sfarim Meseches avodas kochavim b'perakein mamid, and this is what's written in Meseches avodas zara. And so the Gemara instead interprets the pasuk by the Sanhedrin, I isa lekulu Sanhedrin shal shivim v'echad. If you have the whole Sanhedrin of 71, Havehora, that's considered a ruling, Aval Bishalahoru Kolosan, Shiash Veloris, even though not everybody that was sitting issued that ruling. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Yoshua says, Yud Sheyoshvin Bedin, if there are 10 judges that are sitting in judgment, Kolar Taloi B'Tzavra Kula, and the chain, it hangs around all of their necks. They're all responsible for the ruling that they issue. And the Gemara says, Pshita, well, isn't that obvious? Of course they're responsible. And the Gemara says, HaKamash Malon, what it's teaching us is, Da'afilu Talmud B'fnei Rabbu, even if there's a student there sitting in front of his Rebbe, the student should not be silent. If he feels there is a mistake, he should speak out, because the responsibility lies with him as well. And the Gemara continues, Rav Huna ki avin nafik lebeidin, or Rav Huna, when he went to court in order to judge a case, Maisi asara tanoi dvei rav lekamei, he would bring 10 tanoim of the study hall in front of him, and the tanoim we are referring to over here are those who used to recite the Mishnayos and the Braisos, and the reason why he did that was kihechi, in order to nimti on shiva mikshura, that we should all receive a splinter from the beam, meaning to say there'll be a lot of us, so we're all only going to bear a small responsibility each for the ruling. And the Gemara continues along the same lines. Rav Ashi ki have a maisi terifta lekamei. Rav Ashi, when they would bring an animal to be judged whether it was a treif in front of him, maisi asar tivchei mi masa mechasi. He would bring 10 slaughterers from masa mechasia, or most of kamei. They would sit in front of him. Amar, and again he said, ki echa denimtion shiva mikshura. That way, we're all going to receive just a splinter from the beam. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Horu Bezdin v'yadu shato. Let's say Bezdin issued a ruling, and they know they made a mistake, v'chazru behen, and they retracted. Bein shehiviu kaparasun uvein shelo heviu kaparasun, whether they brought their atonement, whether they did not bring their atonement. V'halach v'yas alpian, and then someone goes ahead and does according to their ruling. He does not realize that the Bezdin retracted. So the question is, in that case, is he exempt from bringing his carbon? Rabbi Shimon poter. Rabbi Shimon says he is exempt. It's considered that he's acting on the ruling of the court, and therefore he is exempt. Rabbi Lazar Omer Safek, and Rabbi Lazar says it's actually a situation of doubt. We'll see Rashi in a moment exactly what that means. The Mishnah continues, Eizehu Safek. Now, in which case is it a doubt? Yashav lo besoch beiso chayiv. If he's sitting in his house, so then he's obligated. Then it's considered a doubt, and he has to bring what's called an asham talui because of the fact that there is a doubt he may have committed the avera. But halach lo lemedinas hayam pater. But if he's traveling, then he's exempt. Amar Rabbi Akiva says, Modani baza. I admit about this. Shukarov liftor menachov. If someone's traveling, he's closer to being exempt than being liable. He has a good reason why he would not have heard of the Bezdin's retraction because he was traveling. Amar lo Ben Azai. Ben Azai said to him, Maishna zem and ayoshe bebeisa. What's the difference this guy traveling than someone sitting in his house? And Rabbi Akiva explained, as we just said, shayoshe bebeisa, somebody who's sitting in his house, efshar hoyalo sheyishma. It's possible that he would have heard that the Bezdin retracted. V'zeh, but this guy traveling, lo hoyalo efshar sheyishma. It's not possible that he heard, and that's why we have more reason to say that he is exempt. And Rashi explains, Horu Bezdin, again, the Bezdin, the Sanhedrin, they issued their ruling, V'asu rov tzibur al piem. This is talking about a case where the majority of the community followed their ruling, so you have a situation where the par has to be brought. V'yadu shato v'chazru meheras, and then they know they made a mistake, they retract their ruling. Bein sheviu kaparasun uvein shelo yiviu kaparasun, whether they brought their atonement or not. Ula'achar sheyadu shato, the point here is, after they found out that they made a mistake and they retracted, halach hayachid v'asa al piem, then an individual goes ahead and he does according to their ruling. Now this guy, he's not connected with the majority of the community because he committed the avera after they found out that the court already had retracted. Rabbi Shimon poter. So in this case, Rabbi Shimon says he's exempt because he's doing it based on the ruling of the court, so to speak, with the permission of the court. Because this person, he doesn't know that they made a mistake, and that they retracted. He's relying on the court. Hilkach pater. Therefore, he's exempt. Rabbi Lazar Omer Safek. Rabbi Lazar says no, it's a doubt. Kolomar Safek ikatola bebezin ikatola biatzmo dami. Meaning it's a doubt whether it's considered that he's relying on bezin or himself. Umevi an asham tali, in a situation where you're not sure if you're liable to a chatzos, you bring what's called an asham tali. Ve'ezehu Safek. The Mishnah then said, what is the doubt? Kilomar amayu chayev asham tali. It's as if the Mishnah is asking, why is he chayev in asham tali? Yashav lo bebezo chayev asham tali. If he's in his house, he's chayev to bring the asham tali. Shukharov lipitor. But if he's traveling already, it's close to being exempt to have a vaday tola bebezin. There certainly he's relying on the court. Shelo yada chazarazin. He doesn't know anything about their retracting. However, halach lo lemedinas hayam, since he's traveling. Amar lo ben azai maishna zesh halach lemedinas hayam and ayoshe bebeso. Ben Azai says, what's the difference between the guy traveling and the guy in his house? Amar lo Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva said to him, Lafi shayoshe bebeso, because someone who's sitting in his house, efshar sheyishma shebezin chazru ben. It's possible he'll hear that bezin retracted. V'havikarav latola biatzmo. So there already, it's like he's doing it himself. Well, lafika chayev lahavi asham tali. That's why he has to bring the asham tali. V'zeh shahalach lemedinas hayam. But this guy traveling, lahayachol lishmo, he couldn't have heard anything. V'havitola bebezin mamish. He really was relying on the courts. Hilkach pater. Therefore, he is exempt. And the Mishnah continues, Horu Bezdin la'akor es kol haguf. Let's say the Bezdin issues a ruling to uproot an entire mitzvah in the Torah. For example, Amr, they say, Ein nida b'Torah. There's no laws of nida in the Torah. Ein Shabbos b'Torah. There's no laws of Shabbos in the Torah. Ein avodas kochavim b'Torah. There's no laws of avodah zarah in the Torah. Harei elu b'Torah. And in such a case, they're exempt. That's not considered a mistaken ruling which you bring this carbon for. And the Mishnah continues, Horu levatel mixas ulakayim mixas. If the Sanhedrin issues a ruling to nullify part of a mitzvah, but to fulfill part of the mitzvah, they don't uproot the entire mitzvah, harei lo chayav. And then already they're liable for the mistaken ruling. Ketzad, how so? Amru yesh nida b'Torah. For example, let's say they say there is a concept of need in the Torah. Aval habal shomeres yom keneged yom. But somebody who has relations with a shomeres yom keneged yom, pater is exempt. That would be mistaken in part of the mitzvah. They're acknowledging that there's a concept of nida, but they're making a mistake in terms of a shomeres yom keneged yom. A shomeres yom keneged yom is a woman who sees blood during the time she's not expecting her period, so she's supposed to watch the next day to see if she sees any blood, and a person is not exempt if they have relations with a shomeres yom keneged yom, and they make a mistake with regards to that issue. Or, for example, yesh Shabbos b'Torah. Let's say they acknowledge there's Shabbos in the Torah. Aval hamotzi merishas hayachid l'rishas rabin pater, but the Sanhedrin mistakenly says that somebody who transfers something from rishas hayachid, the private domain, to rishas rabin, the public domain, is pater, is exempt, and that was their mistaken ruling, even though they acknowledge the concept of Shabbos. Or yesh avodas kocham b'Torah. They say there is avodah zarah in the Torah. Aval hamishtachav pater, but they say someone who bows to avodah zarah is exempt. Harei lo chayav. And in all of these cases, they are liable for the mistaken ruling. Shenemar, and how do we know this? Because it says in the pasuk v'nelam davar, and we understand that to mean davar. There's something that they made a mistake on. It means davar v'lo kol haguf. It means some part of the mitzvah, but not that they're uprooting the entire concept of the mitzvah. And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, my time with Rabbi Shimon. What's the reason of Rabbi Shimon? Again, Rabbi Shimon says that if an individual acts in accordance with the ruling of the court, but the court had actually retracted, the person just wasn't aware that the court retracted, so Rabbi Shimon said pater. And so the question is, what's the reason of Rabbi Shimon? Why does Rabbi Shimon say pater? And Rav explains, Hoel uvrashos bezdin hu osa. Since he was doing it with the permission of the court, he thought the court had said that it is permitted, therefore he is exempt. And the Gemara continues, Ika diamri, there are those that say a different version of the statement of Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, Omer Hayer Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon would say, Kol hora sheyatza berov tzibor. Any ruling that goes out with the majority of the community, Rashi will explain this, Yachid ha'osa osa pater. If an individual then acts upon it, he is exempt. Lefi shelo nitna hora ela lahavchin bein shogeg lemezid. Because a ruling is, the whole purpose of a ruling is to be able to distinguish between something by mistake and something on purpose. And Rashi explains, Kol hora sheyatza berov tzibor. Any ruling that goes out with the majority of the community, even though the court already retracted that ruling, Yachid ha'osa osa pater. If an individual acts in accordance with the ruling, he is exempt. Because the whole purpose of the hora is to distinguish between a mistake and on purpose. And Rashi is going to give two explanations of what this means. The first explanation is lahodia sha'osa al pm, to make it known that the person who's acting based on their ruling, shogegu v'lo mezeru, that he's doing it by mistake and not on purpose. V'zeh al pi hora hu osa. This person is acting because of the ruling. Lafikach shogeg, who therefore is considered a shogeg. V'yachid sha'asa b'horas bezin pater. And if an individual acts in accordance with the ruling of the court, he is exempt. According to this first explanation of Rashi, the shogeg, the fact that he's shogeg, the ruling of the court tells us he's a shogeg. Him being a shogeg is what exempts him. Perush Acher, another explanation, lo nitna hora liftor yachid hatola ba. The whole reason of the ruling, that it comes to exempt a person who's relying on the ruling, ela lahaker lebein, it's in order to distinguish between osa b'shigagas atzmo, somebody who does it with his own mistake. According to this interpretation, the shogeg is the guy actually who has to bring the carbon, because it's shigagas atzmo, it's his mistake. La'osa mezid uvershus bezin, as opposed to somebody who's doing it on purpose because he thinks he has the permission of the court, that person is called the mezid, and he's actually the one that's exempt from bringing the carbon. V'zeh omer lanu, and this person, he's telling us, shelo yada shechazru, that he didn't know that they retracted, umezid asal piyam, and he was doing it on purpose based on their ruling. V'lo el shigagas atzmo, this was not his mistake. V'yachid shasa b'horas bezin pater, and if an individual acts according to the ruling of the court, he is exempt. And the Gemara continues, Meisvei, we have a question from the following brisa. Par helim dover shel tzibor, the par that is brought if the community sins, usiirei avodas kochavim, or let's say the goats that are brought by a sin of communal sin of avodah zarah. So you want to collect the money for these karbanos. So we have a machlokas tanoim exactly where the money comes from. Betchila goven alei and divrei Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says you do a special collection from the outset just for the purpose of bringing these karbanos. Rabbi Yehuda says mitrumas halishka hein boin. It's not true. We just rely on the trumas halishka, the general communal funds in the Beis Hamikdash. We rely on those to bring these karbanos. And so the Gemara here is focusing on Rabbi Shimon, because again, Rabbi Shimon in our Mishnah says that the individual is exempt when the Bezin retracts, because the individual was still relying on the court, even though the court retracted, he was not aware. And so the Gemara is asking, Amai, so why is that true? Kevan de Gavilu, if according to Rabbi Shimon, as we just said in this brisa, they're doing a special collection just to bring the carbon for the communal sin, so Havale Hoda, so then apparently everybody's aware of the communal sin, and everybody's aware now that the Bezin has retracted the ruling. So how can we say that this person is not aware and he's relying on the court? It doesn't make sense. There was a special collection of funds just to bring the carbon for this purpose, because there was an awareness that the Bezin had issued a mistaken ruling. And the Gemara answers, if you want, I could say, that even though they're doing a collection specific for this purpose, they didn't announce why they're collecting. They just collected for this purpose without the announcement, and that's why the person really was not aware. Or you could say, he just wasn't in the city when they were doing this collection, so if he wasn't in the city, he wasn't aware. Or if you want, I could say, Rav ki'idach Tana Sava. Rav holds like the other Tana, meaning there is another Tana that learns the brisa in the reverse, that it's Rabbi Yehuda who says that they do a special collection for these karbanos, but Rabbi Shimon says it's from the Trumas Halishka. The Tanya Ivches, we learned in a brisa the opposite, Betchila Govin Lahen Divrei Rabbi Yehuda, that they do a special collection just for these karbanos. That's what Rabbi Yehuda says. Rabbi Shimon Omer, but Rabbi Shimon says Mitrumas Halishka Hein Boin, that it all comes from the Trumas Halishka, the general communal funds, and that's why the person is not aware that the Bezin retracted. And the Gemara continues, Tanya was taught, Rabbi Meir Mechayev, in this case, again, where the Bezin retracts, Rabbi Meir says the person is obligated to bring a carbon. For Rabbi Shimon Pot, Rabbi Shimon says he's exempt, because again, according to Rabbi Shimon, the person can simply say he was not aware that the Bezin changed their ruling. Rabbi Lazar Omer Safik, Rabbi Lazar says that it is a doubt. That means to say that the Asham Taloi is brought, and Mishum Sumchas Amru Taloi. And in the name of Sumchas, they say that it's Taloi, means to say it's suspended, we just have no idea, and therefore, according to Sumchas, no carbon is brought, not even an Asham Taloi. Rabbi Yochanan says, Asham Taloi, Ika Beinayu. The difference between Rabbi Lazar and Sumchas is, according to Rabbi Lazar, that it's a suffix and you bring an Asham Taloi, but according to Sumchas, it is Taloi, and it means you don't bring any carbon, not even an Asham Taloi. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Zeira says, Mashal to Rabbi Lazar Lamah Hadavar Damer. What's a mashal to what Rabbi Lazar is saying, that it is a doubt, and therefore you bring an Asham Taloi? La'adam sha'achal safek chaylev, safek shuman. Let's say a person ate something. It's a doubt whether it's chaylev, which is not kosher, or shuman, which is kosher. V'noda lo, and then he becomes aware that he ate something which had this doubt. Shemei v'asham, so he brings the Asham Taloi, and this is similar to that. And Rashi explains, Meisvei par helam davar shal tzibor kagon shahoru bezin ba'avodas kochavim v'yasu tzibor al piyam. Again, it would be a case the bezin issued a ruling by avodah zara. The community acted in accordance with what they said. V'yadu shato, and then they realized they made the mistake. V'chazru ben, and they retracted. Utzrichin mos kedei likach par usirei avodas kochavim shal tzibor. And so now you need money in order to purchase the par that's going to be brought, or the sirei avodas kochavim of the tzibor that are going to be brought. So how do you collect that money? Betchila govin lahem she gizborin govin mikol echem miyisrael mos liknos mehem par usirei avodas kochavim l'tzorech carbon. Divrei Rabbi Shimon, it means the treasurers have to go around collecting from everybody money in order to bring these karbanos. V'amai kamer Rabbi Shimon departer the vershus bezin uosa. But if that's the case, why does Rabbi Shimon say he's exempt? Because he's acting with the permission of the court. Hakeven de agbilu mos l'tzorech par helam davar shel tzibor. If they're already collecting money to bring the par helam davar shel tzibor, have a misyada leisha bezin to. It's well known that the court made a mistake. V'chazru me'ora asan, and they retracted the ruling. V'amai have a tola bebezin. Why is that considered relying on the court? It could be they just collected from him, but they didn't tell him what they were collecting for. Maybe he wasn't in the city when they collected. And it was after the collection that he did in accordance with the ruling. He didn't know that they retracted. Rabbi Shimon says the money comes from the communal funds. Therefore, it's not well known. That's why when he acts in accordance with the ruling, he is relying on the court. Hilkach pater Rabbi Shimon. That's why Rabbi Shimon says exempt. V'tana the Masnisan hachis svirulei, and the Tana Ramesh holds like that. I'll leave with Rabbi Shimon. He'll hold in the version that Rabbi Shimon holds the mitrumas halishka hein boin, that the money came from the general communal funds. Tanya Rabbi Meir Mechayev, the Tola Batz Mohava. We have a brisa that Rabbi Meir says Chayev in this case because it's considered like he's relying on himself. He can't simply say that he wasn't aware of the retraction. For Rabbi Shimon Poter, the Tola Bebezen Haver, Rabbi Shimon says he's exempt because it is considered he's relying on the court. He was not aware of the retraction. Rabbi Lazar Omer Safik Mevi Asham Taloi. Rabbi Lazar says it's a doubt, and he brings an Asham Taloi. And then the Gemara said, Ika beinayu. The difference between Rabbi Elazar and Sumchis is whether he brings the Asham Talui. Bein Rabbi Elazar l'Sumchis, l'Sumchis eino mevi Asham Talui. According to Sumchis, it's Talui, but there's no Asham Talui. Dehachi kamar Sumchis. This is what Sumchis means. Maisa shelo Taluihu. What he did is Talui. V'lek l'meimar shema tola bi'atzmo have. You can't say that maybe he's doing it on his own. To lo have bar chiyav me'alya. It's not something. It's not a clear chiyav over here. Tehecha dehave lefanav chaticha acha savik shel chaylev savik shel shuman. If you had a case where in front of him was a piece of chaylev, a piece of meat, and we don't know if it was chaylev, we don't know if it was shuman, it was a piece of fat, we don't know exactly what it was. V'yachlo and he eats it. Bedinu demevi asham tali. There it makes sense to bring an asham tali. Mishum deikol meimar shema chaylev mamish achal, because you can say he might have actually eaten chaylev to have a bar chiyav malya. That's a full chiyav. Aval hachal lekol meimar shema tola biatzmo mamishu. Here, there's no possibility that he was totally relying on himself. Sharei al piho rohu osa. He certainly was acting from what the court said. Hilkach ma'isa shalo taloyu. Therefore, his action is taloy. The tzad chiyav shalo taloyu. The idea that he might be chayiv, it's unclear. To lo have it tzad chiyav ma'ali. It's not a full-fledged chiyav. Hilkach eino mevi asham taloy. Therefore, he doesn't bring an asham taloy. But the other point of view is it is similar to a person who eats a safek chaylev or shuman. He thought it was shuman. Then he finds out there's a doubt. He brings an asham tali. Mishum the shema chaylev mamish, because maybe it was chaylev. Aval hachanami the shema chaylev mamish achal, because maybe he actually ate chaylev. Hachanami here also equal meimar shema tola biatzmo mamish. Who you could say maybe he really was acting on his own. He wasn't really relying on the court. Maybe that's how we view it, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Dalid Amud Aleph.